To introduce myself a little bit further. So my name again is Father Tait Schroeder. I was ordained a priest in 2002 for the Diocese of Madison, and so I've been a priest now for 11 years. Half of my priesthood I've actually spent in Rome. I spent the last about 4.5 years in Rome studying canon law, which is the law of the church. And my role now that I'm back here in the diocese is working for the tribunal. So the marriage tribunal is kind of the bishop's court, so to speak, but it really looks a lot at marriage nullity. Okay, so we're looking at cases where the marriage maybe has failed and people are wondering, is my marriage valid? Would I be able to remarry in the church or not? Okay, so that's what we're looking at. So it's kind of odd, right? The talk on free, total, faithful, fruitful love, especially maybe as that's lived out in marriage, that you invite this celibate priest to talk about it. And especially a priest who deals day in and day out with maybe those failed marriages where we don't see that type of love reflected. And yet, I think kind of having that perspective, seeing a lot of the sad parts of failed marriages, you can see where we need to really focus and have strong marriage, but not only with marriage, but maybe more in general, this kind of love that Christ has for the church. And now that the Bible has arrived, I'd like to just start with a little reading from St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians. And I think this is a very, maybe a somewhat familiar passage, but we often don't hear it in its entirety. Sometimes there's an option where you can have at Mass just the shorter version, but you miss some very good parts of this here. So here we see St. Paul writing to the Ephesians, and especially talking about what is the relationship that husbands and wives should have. We hear this: be subordinate to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives should be subordinate to their husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is head of his wife, just as Christ is head of the church, he himself the Savior of the body. As the church is subordinate to Christ, so wives should be subordinate to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church and handed himself over for her to sanctify her, cleansing her by the bath of water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. So also husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one hates his own flesh, but rather nourishes and cherishes it, even as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. For this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother, and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak in reference to Christ and the church. In any case, each one of you should love his wife as himself, and the wife should respect her husband. Now, when we have the shorter version at Mass, can you imagine what phrases they leave out? It's right at the beginning. Wives should be subordinate to their husbands as to the Lord. Now, I think sometimes in our kind of culture where, sometimes there's maybe a very strong kind of feminist current or whatever, there's this rejection, subordinate. That seems inappropriate, right? Shouldn't husbands and wives be equal? Well, I think that's ultimately what St. Paul is saying, but it's not, kind of a seeking for power, but it's an emptying of self for the other, right? And if we talk about being subordinate, what does that mean? Under the order, under the direction, right, of the husband. What is the husband's role? It's to get his wife to heaven. And the wife's role is also to get her husband to heaven, right? Because how is the husband supposed to love his wife? It's this kind of total self-sacrificing, self-giving love, right? It's not that husbands get to kind of boss their wives around. No, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Whenever we see a crucifix, that's the kind of love that Christ has for the church. Now, so St. Paul is writing to the Ephesians speaking about this. And really, this is where we kind of understand marriage as a sacrament. When we hear, this is a great mystery. In the Latin, it was translated as sacramentum, right? So we see that marriage is a sacrament. But marriage is also something that was there before Christ came, right? Think about the other sacraments. They were instituted by Christ. They were started by Christ. Okay? Marriage, however, was there beforehand. And it was raised to the level of a sacrament for those who are baptized by Christ. But marriage was something that was there from the very beginning. When we look at chapter 1 of Genesis, we see Adam and Eve and their marriage. Okay, so marriage is something that's there from the beginning. So what should be part of every marriage, right? Even if marriage was there before Christ, before it was raised to the level of the sacrament, what should be there? Well, it's this idea that it's free, total, faithful, and fruitful. Those are the elements that need to be present for every valid marriage, whether it's a sacrament, meaning between those who are baptized, or whether it's for two unbaptized persons. Those elements still need to be there, because that's kind of how, in a sense, God has designed us as men and women, but also how then he gives the model in what he does. So we want to take and kind of break apart those four different elements: free, total, faithful, and fruitful. We're going to talk a little bit about those from the church's perspective, and especially what the church sees in terms of going into or making up a valid marriage. Freedom. What kind of freedom do you have to enter marriage? Well, there are a couple of things, especially that we can see. There has to be a freedom from what we call impediments. Those would be things that kind of stand in the way of getting married. Can anyone think of an impediment to marriage? You're already married. That's a great one.
Pathological liar. So, for example, you couldn't actually make a promise that.
Okay, so that it's not technically an impediment. That'll get to be something I come here to in a moment. And the other impediment is kind of like, it's a fact that would prevent you from getting married. So the fact that you're already married means you can't get married again. What would be another fact that would prevent you from marrying? Age, yes, that is an impediment. And why? Well, because of what happens in marriage, right? There's this one flesh union. You heard St. Paul speak about that, right? So kind of the bare minimum for getting married is, can you guess what age that might be? What would set the minimum age to get married?
Sexual relative maturity.
Yeah, so puberty, right? Okay. So believe it or not, the bare minimum for the church for girls is what age?
14.
14, yeah. And for boys?
16.
16. Oh, yeah, buddy candidates. Wow, that's great. So that would be the bare minimum. Of course, the state might have other laws or whatever. Can anyone think of just another impediment?
I think within the church, I guess if you don't have an annulment or...
Right, that would kind of be getting to what she was saying. If you're not free to marry, if you're already married, right, you're not free to get married again. Yes?
You can't be related to one another.
Right. So now I don't have any sisters, but I couldn't marry my sister, right? Okay. So sometimes those impediments make you're not free then to enter into marriage because of some fact or relationship that's there, okay? Now, not only the church has impediments, but you think about the state with their requirements, right? You can't marry your sister in the state. For the age in the state, they wouldn't allow under 16, but you'd also have to have your parents' permission, and etc., like things like that, okay? So those are impediments. Those are things, kind of these situations that wouldn't allow you to be free. But then we get into these other issues, like he said, you're a pathological liar. Maybe you have some very serious kind of psychological disorder, bipolar disorder, very serious, not treated, whatever. Those would be other kinds of, well, we don't call them impediments, but you're not free to give that because you can't give a full consent to marriage, right? That's one of the very important kind of principles that came out about marriage, is that what makes marriage, it's the consent of the man and the woman. That's what makes the marriage. And that's why, there's this exchange of vows. Because when the husband and wife are there and they exchange those vows, that's when they publicly show, I take you to be my wife, I take you to be my husband. So that consent is vital. This is what kind of makes the marriage happen. But if you can't give the consent, if you're not able to give that consent, then something is wrong and the marriage wouldn't come about. So it could be some psychological issue, but you could also exclude certain things from marriage. And I'm going to get into that here in a little bit. There's one other thing that the church would consider to maybe not make you free to marry, or it places a little bit of a restriction on how people are able to get married. When you think of what that would be, so we talked about impediments, these kind of facts. We've talked about how you're able to give consent. There's one other thing that's important, at least the church kind of sees as important for marriage. Yeah?
People in other faiths, for example, you're married, if you're a Catholic Christian, and you want to marry someone who's Arabic and they're Muslim.
Right, that's actually an impediment. That's called what we call a disparity of cult, right? So if a non-baptized person can't marry a Catholic without a special dispensation, it's a possibility, but it requires a dispensation from the bishop or
How does it usually go?
Pardon?
For example, how does it usually go? Dispensation.
So it's basically the person would request that from the bishop or the vicar general, who's kind of like the bishop's right-hand man, and it gives, then they can just grant that permission, and then they're free to marry.
So it could still be a sacrament if that happens?
Good question. No, it's not a sacramental marriage, but it is a valid marriage bond. Remember, because we talked about marriage is something that existed from the beginning. And so even if it's not that sacramental part, it does have to have some of these things. Now, for some people, not all those impediments apply. But for Catholics, there are some other impediments. Like, okay, an impediment to getting married is if you've been ordained. So I cannot get married. I have an impediment, right? But that wouldn't apply to someone who's not baptized. Okay? But it wouldn't be a sacrament, because for a sacrament, it has to be both persons who are baptized. What I'm getting at for this third piece about freedom is the form of marriage. The form of marriage. And why is that important? Well, first of all, what is form? The canonical form of marriage means that a Catholic, any Catholic, if you've been baptized Catholic or if you've been received into the Catholic Church, you have to exchange that marital consent before a priest, a deacon, or a bishop, and 2 witnesses. Okay. Again, that can be dispensed, meaning there can be permission for it to happen elsewhere in another way, but without that, it wouldn't be a valid marriage. So if a Catholic and a Lutheran want to get married in front of the Justice of the Peace, and they don't get that dispensation, that would be an invalid marriage, because it doesn't have the right form. Why does the church say that this form is important? Well, because of the public nature of what marriage is. Remember, St. Paul is talking about marriage as a great mystery. It's a sign of the love that Christ has for his church. So married couples are really models of how Christ loves the church, kind of this self-sacrificing, self-giving love for the other. Okay? And that has a public witness, and that has a public dimension to it. So without kind of following that public expression of faith, the church says that for Catholics, that's not a valid marriage. Now, of course, if there are two Hindus or two Muslims or a Lutheran and a Methodist, however, whatever combination you want to have, they're sometimes bound by their own rules, but if they don't have any rules, any kind of publicly recognized ceremony suffices for them. But for Catholics, the church has this particular form. So that kind of gets into some of the technical things about freedom, right? But what it is meaning is love can't be forced, okay? And you have to be able to give really yourself to the other. And so like we say, there can be those kind of impediments, or there could be a problem with your consent. Either you're not able to give it, or you leave something essential out, or you don't have this public form for your marriage. Freedom. Why don't we talk about total? Okay? Free total. What does total mean? Well, think about how Christ loves the church, his bride. It's that dying on the cross. That is that ultimate self-gift. It's to the end, right? We hear in St. John's Gospel that he loved those who are his own in this world, and he loved them to the end. Right? It's this willingness to give till the end. Okay? Well, that's what this total kind of love in marriage is as well. It's a love that goes until death, right? It's until death do us part. And this permanence of marriage speaks about that totality, right? Okay, we know that divorce is a civil reality. But for the church, that's not what we understand marriage to be. Marriage is not something that can be broken. This consent that the couple gives is total, meaning it's lifelong, it's to the end. Okay? Now, obviously, sometimes there are situations where divorce has to, in a sense, happen, right? The separation of the couple, maybe because there's abuse or serious alcohol problems, whatever it could be. Okay? So maybe that divorce has to happen. And yet, that doesn't necessarily break that bond, that consent that the couple gave. Okay? And if, in fact, a person was not wanting to be in a marriage that is for life, saying, I'm going to be with you until either one of us dies, okay, then that would, in fact, invalidate the marriage, because you're not having this total gift, this kind of all-in mentality, right? Based, again, on what Christ has done, but even more so, what is the nature of that relationship? To entrust, this gift of sexuality to someone else, to have children together, to give the environment to raise those children, okay? That requires this lifelong commitment. So that's part of that totality. Okay? But going along very much with that totality until death, right? This complete self-gift and acceptance of the other comes faithful. Okay? The fidelity of marriage and the fidelity of the couple is also something that reflects very beautifully how Christ loves the church, but it's also that safety where the couple then can grow together, work together, and, in a sense, raise a family. In there, this is a problem if someone is saying, I'm going to take you for my wife, but I reserve the right to have an affair if that should happen, right? Doesn't that seem like a very strange kind of thought, to be entering into this commitment but not wanting to be faithful. Well, if you do exclude that fidelity, having that one partner for the rest of your life, then that would be an invalid marriage. So that's part of that faithful love. And then there's fruitful love. Okay? This means that what is marriage directed towards? What is it geared towards? Okay? It's geared toward the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of children. Okay? Those two really can't be separated. You can't have just the good of the spouses but no kids. Or just kids only but not really worrying about the good of the spouses. Okay? So there too, love is fruitful. If we look again to that model, which is Christ and his bride, the church, that love is fruitful, right? Because Christ's death on the cross brings forth new members through baptism, right? The blood and the water that flowed from his side are the fountain of sacramental life in the church. Okay? So baptism is a way that the church then becomes fruitful through that self-gift of Christ. Well, it's the same for husband and wife, that there must be this openness and this availability for the bringing of children into the world and then raising them, taking care of them, providing for their education. Okay. So without that, again, if you're excluding children from the marriage, or if you're going to say, well, okay, maybe one kid and then that's it, or we're going to wait and see, those are going to be problems with that kind of consent that is total, faithful, and then fruitful. Now, obviously, we know that couples aren't always able to have children. Does that make the marriage invalid? No. But if there's not this openness to children, to that gift of God, then that's where that problem with consent might come in, because they're not having that openness to children. Okay. That's kind of, again, some of those maybe basic points. Does anyone have any questions about anything I said so far?
So what about elderly people? Can they get remarried if their spouse dies? I mean, obviously, is that open? Could you even say that's open to children at that point?
Right. So it would be possible, right? Because there's the potential, okay? But it just happens that, if the couple is not, able, if the man is impotent at that point, is it a perpetual kind of impotence, or is it something that's more because of age, right? So say a couple grows old, together, and they're still married, right? But they're not able to have sexual relations. That doesn't invalidate their marriage. Because of the age part, that is, in a sense, it's maybe a natural factor that would come up, right? That is allowed then that they could still get married.
I meant like somebody who was older and their spouse died or something. Could they get remarried when they're already older?
Oh, certainly.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The one issue would be potentially, is there a question about the ability to have sexual relations, because obviously that's something that's integral to husband and wife relationship. So there has to at least be that, at least in kind of potential ability for that. But that happens quite frequently, especially now as people are living longer. So that, again, marriage is a sacrament or a reality that's a bit unlike some of the other sacraments like baptism and confirmation and holy orders, right? Those are sacraments which give us an indelible mark, meaning they can't be repeated. Marriage could be repeated if one of the spouses dies, right? So if the spouse dies, that until death part kind of ceases. So they would be free then, or able to marry again. And I think that we'll see probably a little bit more of that as, people live longer, too. Yes.
Just given what you said about the value of children, given this last gentleman's question too, what about just people who simply are, let's say, in their 60s and they simply choose to, their spouse may pass up or maybe they simply want to marry and they want to have a valid marriage, they're not going to have any kids, it's not going to cost them money. Are you saying that that sort of marriage is not as valid as a younger person?
No, it would be a valid marriage, right? But there's at least, again, some openness to the fruitfulness of that union, right? Okay, because the natural course of things, they're past childbearing age, that isn't as important. So even if there was a younger couple who had problems, that they couldn't have children, that wouldn't make the marriage invalid. Is there an openness, though, to give life? Does that relationship bear some fruit in terms of maybe how they serve others, how they love others, right? Because, again, marriage isn't a reality that's just for the couple. It's a reality that goes beyond the couple. The way in which they relate to others, serve others.
So for example, connecting what you said towards the gentleman said, my grandmother on my father's side, her husband had indeed passed away, but she was married at about 60 years old. And they lived together happily from age 60 to about 84. She passed on about 84 years old. They had a great marriage for 24 years.
Right. So that is a valid marriage. There are some questions here.
Yes, actually, so you talked earlier about the potential for being open to life. So I see, I would like some clarification on that because, so there's a real sense in which a couple that's past childbearing years doesn't have the potential to have children anymore. And say a younger couple where the one's had a hysterectomy, there's a very real sense in which there's no potential to have children anymore. Or something along those lines, or a man who's been sterilized due to chemotherapy or cancer or something like that. So in what sense is there any potential for children in that situation?
Well, certainly, at least, is number one, with a couple maybe be open for adoption. That could be one way in which they could, in a sense, still be open to children, even though they themselves might not be able to have children. But also to look at the reasons that they might not be able to have children, right? Is the man sterile? Well, that's one thing. Is it because of, say, as you say, chemotherapy or something? Or is he not able to have children because of a vasectomy, because he wanted to, purposefully not have children? So that it's a bit of a looking at kind of the situation of the people and the intention behind what they do. Because again, that would be an intention where you're clearly not open to children. All right?
So just kind of a follow-up thing. So you also said that it's one, I see how clearly saying that you're just not going to have children, that's clearly just not open to anything like that. But having like a very small number of children, like maybe one or something like that, you also said isn't open to...
Well,
so just could you clarify that a little?
Sure. In fact, I'm an only child.
Okay.
I don't think my parents' marriage isn't bad. But, so the issue there is, kind of reserving to yourself as one person in the marriage to say, we'll have X number of children, whether it's one or two, but then no more, and I'm going to control then what's going to happen.
So it's the unilateral...
Exactly.
Okay, right. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, so that's part of it. And also, certainly, the church talks about natural family planning, right? And so, and this is very much part of when we talk about kind of this free, total, faithful, fruitful love, right? There's kind of the use of a woman's natural cycle to space children or to postpone maybe having children because of, some proportionate reason. Okay? But it also is a way to conceive children. So, you have this sense, if, things are very difficult financially, it would be, not maybe as prudent at that moment to have children, that's not going to invalidate the marriage. Sometimes, of course, the means are sinful, in terms of if we're talking about artificial contraception, things like that. But, you know, it wouldn't necessarily invalidate the marriage there. So
the couple went into this marriage deciding that they would say, instead of using FP, they would say in common instead. That would actually invalidate the marriage.
Well, it could invalidate the marriage. It may not.
Okay.
It is a bit tricky, but the reason is because are they
So,
postponing children?
Right, postponing it for like financial reasons.
Right. Or are they postponing forever? Or not having children, ever, not being open to children in that relationship? Yes.
Now, one thing with regards to, I guess, gay marriage, and I don't know if you're going to talk about this later in the talk, is I've heard it argued that it fails in the fruitful aspect of fruitful people. But you were talking about the idea that being open to children can even be something so far as to be open to adoption. I was wondering if you could speak to that specific issue.
Okay. Some of that has to do a bit with the church's understanding of natural law, and also the complementarity, right, that's there between man and woman, and what value that has for a child who's growing up. Okay? So, at least in some marriages where, okay, they're not able to have children, man and woman, because of some maybe fertility issue, whatever, at least there's the potential that the sexual act of the husband and wife, it would in some way be possible. For a homosexual couple, that kind of act is never capable of bringing forth children into the world. So, whether this happens or not, it's a matter of saying, is the act even capable of doing it or not? And so in the sense of a homosexual couple, that it's never possible that some kind of sexual act between them could bring forth life. So that's where the church is thinking about that fruitful love, okay, there. And it would be, like I said earlier too, with even a heterosexual couple who is not able, or who is using artificial contraception. That's a sinful means because they're cutting out even the potential for life. Again, what is the intention? Are they trying to delay having children? Okay, maybe that's the point, but it's the means also that goes into making up a moral judgment about the act or the situation. So I would say a lot of it has to do with that fruitful part, but also with kind of the natural law aspect of what that human sexual embrace is about. Yes.
Or I guess I was reading the passage where it said that for God there is no captive nor free, no man or woman. So I was wondering if that would not apply to gay marriage, or would you?
No, I mean, whenever we're reading the scriptures, and that's why it's important, like with that passage with Ephesians 2, which could be taken out of context or not understood. We do want to see it in the whole kind of picture. What St. Paul is talking about there is in terms of how people are relating to the law, right? Or to, in the sense of the Judaic law, you have to be part of the people of Israel, whatever. No, there's a freedom that goes beyond kind of some of these even very basic physiological distinctions that we find in Jesus Christ. And that's where St. Paul is talking about that. So, we want to be careful when we take a scripture passage that we really look at it in the context. What is St. Paul talking about there? And I think it's really more about that freedom in Christ as opposed to maybe some of those distinctions, Jew or Greek, right? Am I belonging to the people of Israel, or am I, not Israel? So that's where I would say that comes in.
This is maybe backtracking a little bit. It doesn't necessarily with gay marriage, but so NFP a little bit kind of, I don't want to say complicates things, but it's definitely, I don't know, it's difficult to understand sometimes. The way I had understood it, was that basically things, actions have, they tend toward certain ends, right? Sex has an end in procreation, but not necessarily every time that you have sex do you end up procreating, right?
Right. The sexual act has a twofold purpose.
Right. Well,
so the unity and the procreative aspect, the unitive and procreative. And when those two are not together, when there's either one, the unitive without the procreative, or the procreative without the unitive, and that's like talking, IVF, things like that, kind of assisted reproductive technologies that are somehow taken outside of the sexual act, then we're kind of splitting those up. But anyways.
Oh, no, what I was saying was that you could say that if a couple is using NFP, then their purpose when they do have sex in their own minds is not to have children. Their own personal purpose is not to procreate, but to be unitive, right? But the reason that it's okay is because there's a difference between, even if they were capable of having children at that point, maybe their purpose in having sex wasn't to procreate at that given moment. But just because your purpose is not to procreate, as long as you are not disrupting the actual end of sex, like intentionally disrupting the actual action, like through artificial contraception, then that is still open to life. You're not actually disrupting the tendency or end of the sexual act, but maybe your personal purpose at that moment is not.
Right. So it's, again, this kind of talks a little bit about some of those moral aspects, right, too. A couple could decide to use natural family planning, or kind of the scientific, rhythm of a woman's body, but still have an intention to never welcome children. So even the use of NFP could be sinful, and it could, in a sense, invalidate, right? And so instead of saying, the wife saying, I'm going to have a tubal ligation, we're just going to use NFP, because I don't want to have this, but it's so that we'll never, ever, ever have children. Now, that would be maybe a rare thing, but not unheard of. So again, a lot of this is going to the intentionality behind it, right? And so, even if a couple is using natural family planning, but isn't open to that fruitful part, right? Then that's a problem. If they're using it, okay, because they've been praying, they've said it's not prudent for us to have another child at this moment, or whatever, because of these reasons, then it's possible, right? But it's using the natural means. But again, that's the intention. Is it we're delaying children now because of these reasons, or is it because this is the means we're choosing to never have children, or at least never being open to children?
Sorry, I don't mean to harp on this or anything, but the reason
These are
it kind of sometimes, it seems like it would follow from that like, okay, well then every time you have sex, you should be thinking in your mind, like, hope I have a kid this time, and that's just, I don't think that's what the church teaches, that there are lots of reasons that you might personally be having sex at any given moment, and it's not your purpose necessarily in the moment that validates the act, but, I mean, there are lots of things that validate it, but the fact that you are open to it in the means, you know what I'm saying, that you're not disrupting the actual proper end of it. Do you get what I'm,
Is that conveying that it's open to a possibility of having children and not, like, you're not really disrupting it if you're using NFP, but you're maybe open to the possibility because it could happen?
right, you're open to the possibility, but even if you're not using NFT, even if you're not using anything, even if you could totally have a child at that point, not everybody is thinking, you know, about children when they have sex.
Well,
That's such a
that-
terrible thing to say, but
no, that's, it's true. I mean, I have been in the confessional long enough that so, it's like 11 years. But, you know, I think it's also moving towards what the sexual embrace is called to be. That it is called to be, in a sense, an expression in the body of those vows of, I am doing this freely, right? I am doing this in a way that is totally dedicated to you. I'm doing this in a faithful way. And I'm away, it's an act that if God does bless us with a child, then we are open to that as well. And that's why, you know, sexual relations outside of marriage, something's probably going to be missing in that free, total, faithful, fruitful kind of equation, right? It's probably not total, right? Because, again, you know, this sexual embrace is meant for one person. And it's to, again, like for a lot of reasons. But it's there so that it can be for a family if a child should result, right? I'm going to promise to be here for you for whatever comes. Okay? And the same for that fidelity, right? So, yes, it's true that because of our human weakness and human sin, oftentimes the sexual act is not the ideal. But what should it be moving towards? Towards this kind of expression between husband and wife of a free, total, faithful, and fruitful love. As a reminder of those vows, that consent that was given on the wedding day, expressed in the bodies of the husband and wife throughout the life of the marriage. Yes?
So I was actually having a talk with someone the other day about like artificial birth control versus NFP. And I kind of got a little stumped when, because like he asked, like with NFP, like you can like generally have some control over the outcome of the sexual act, like of like whether you're more likely to like get pregnant or not. Not really like letting nature run its course, like you are like controlling like we are gonna have sex now versus like we're gonna like abstain right now. You know, like so like I don't know, I didn't have a very good answer.
Well, I think this is probably going to be the last one because we'll get out of our time limit here. But I think a couple of things to bring to that is natural family planning, yes, gives you also the ability to have intercourse as husband and wife precisely to bring life in, to be even more open because you know when that's going to happen. No artificial means does that. It's only to stop, right? It's not also to promote the, bringing a child into that family. Okay, that's one thing. I had another thought, and it has escaped me because I'm getting old.
I think one thing you said, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
You said the thing about nature running its course. Just because you know the likely statistical outcome, I mean, awareness doesn't mean that you like change the natural outcome or the
statistical likelihood of like what the outcome of the act will be. But like, you're still letting nature happen. Just because you're aware of it doesn't mean that you like have changed the likely outcome.
Yeah,
You're
it's
just
still natural.
aware. Yeah,
You're not taking something that's gonna change the outcome of things. That's an
And
artificial.
the awareness makes a good connection to what you said, that you can use NFP to achieve or avoid hurt.
Yeah, I like that.
Plus, I think in NFP, the issue is not having intercourse. Can that be sinful, like, to not have sex? And then, like, again, not having sex, and that's the same?
Yeah, I mean, there's the idea of the marriage shed, right? It's the idea, so like Paul said in this 1 Corinthians, that basically when you're married, you can't just say, I'm just going to stop having sex now, because you've got this other person's needs that you have to consider as well. So, I mean, if you're going to abstain, it has to be kind of a mutual decision. Sorry if I'm stepping on your toes.
No, I think, I remembered what I was going to say about you. But I better say it quickly before I forget. So, yes, there's an understanding of the, whether this will likely not have, result in a child being conceived or will result in a child being conceived. But it also, because of the nature of what NFP is, it's also a certain sacrificial aspect, and maybe that kind of flows into what I'll say, but, it's not kind of a, if the couple has been praying and discerned that this is not the time to have a child, that means on both of their parts that there has to be this mutual abstaining, right? So, unlike the use of artificial contraception, which could, in a sense, lead to the use of the other, as opposed to kind of that mutual self-gift, but using the other, there's no need to stop, in a sense, or abstain from having sexual intercourse in using that. Now, in terms of that mutual abstaining, again, I think what is the reason for that? And that's the important, again, the intentionality. Yes, there's a certain duty, right? But I don't think we want to focus on that, because that can certainly be abused also. But yes, it has to kind of enter into why would we abstain? Why are we not, being open at this point to that marital embrace, right? If it's meant to be, or if it's kind of the goal is that it's a renewal of those vows that are free, total, faithful, and fruitful, why are we doing it? And then, depending on what the answer is and what the intention is, then it's maybe good or not good. Okay.